and look at the things that we have done so far, and try to. This poem is another Indian English poem, very much like the poem that we did together during the earlier part of the semester, which is the railway clerk. But what would be significant is to make a comparison at a later point of time, which we will be doing tomorrow in our next class, next session together, between the two poems, and see how the poetic sensibility, the tone, this language, the handling of language, all that are significantly different when we are looking at both these poems. There is a certain degree of relevance for doing such a thing, because when we actually go for the examination, it would be very important to make a comparison between the two kinds of two poems that we have done together. And you might get a question which asks you to make such a comparison. However, having said that, and as I said with you, we will be looking into that in the next class. Let us concentrate on the poem A.K. Ramanujan today, get a brief introduction to the poet, move on to some of the other examples of poems that he has done before we actually embark on the poem. All right. So, let us have a look at the poet first. So, he died a little early, I would say, a little over 60 years, and spent the major part of his time in the US as a scholar, as a professor, and wrote both in English and Kannada. He was a poet, was a scholar, folklorist, a playwright, translator, and was competent with more than 5 languages, including Sanskrit and some of the other Dravidian languages. So, when we are looking at his poems, he wrote both in English and Kannada, and you would say that his way of looking at the world, the way of looking at life was something which would take multiculturalism or different cultures into account, okay, and would also look at the way that the country has transformed, glimpses of which we will get as we proceed with this particular poem in the this session as well as in the next session. So, these are some of the things that we will look for in the poems that we will be doing together. So, my strategy today would be to introduce you to another poem by Ramanujan right at the beginning, then to go back to our poem, Some Indian Uses of History on a Rainy Day, but to take up a segment which we do not have in the text, and which is very important to connect to the rest of the text, discuss the title of the poem and some of the issues that are going to be addressed or have been pointed out here, and then in the next session we move into the key components, the key stanzas that we are supposed to do together, and along with that what we will be doing in the process would be to look at the way that they compare with some of his other poems, some of the poems of Nisamagical, and to create a kind of a composite understanding of how these Indian English writers who are specifically writing in English look at the world, use language, use thematic approaches to establish their Indian identity and so on. So, you see that if you are looking at Ramanujan's poems, and we are going to at least have a look at 2 of them, you find that there is an element of Indian tradition and culture which is being looked at, but not in a traditional way, not in a celebratory way, not in a way that glorifies the entire thing, but probably in a manner which is interrogative, questioning, challenging, and examining the entire tradition with a critical eye. The second point is that the style is something which we will find is personal, unique, distinctive to Ramanujan, and yet the themes that he deals with would be ones which very often have universal implications. Family, relationships, memories, emotions play a significant role, but as we will go through the poems, we will realize that there is a certain element of detachment, a certain element of undertone, understatements, an element of irony, presentation of things in a very graphic pictorial way, cinematic presentation, small vignettes or snippets which we have to connect to other snippets to make sense of things, and often contrast, especially in this poem, contrast between time and action are some of the elements that we will be finding as we proceed with this particular text as well as the other texts, and which we will go back to and reiterate as we proceed. So, the first one that I am going to introduce you to is a poem known as A River, and this introduction is something which kind of can be extended to understanding the poet and the way he writes many of these poems, not specifically the poem that we are doing together, but also extended to other poems. So, if you go through this poem, you find that he writes a river, and you need to understand again, as we have discussed with the Negro speaks of a river, the kind of connotation of interrogating, speaking about rivers in a very distinctive way. So, for instance, when we are talking about the Negro speaks of rivers, we are talking where the emphasis, the focus is on not on the river, because many poets have spoken about the river, but a black person speaking about rivers. In this particular case, we realize that the focus is not so much on who is speaking about the glorification of river, but the fact that in general poets have a tradition of celebrating rivers and focusing on their beauty, forgetting about many of the other aspects of a river that they should be interrogating, they should be questioning. So, the poem reads, in Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle, in the sand, bearing sand drips, straw and women's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars under the bridges with patches of repair all over them, the wet stone glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones 7 water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poet only sang of floods. The first part, I would say, kind of introduces us to a river running by Madurai, and then you see that the focus is on temples, the glorification of temples, celebration of grand monuments, and of poets who celebrate those monuments. And then very quickly, interesting metaphors, river dry to a trickle, in the sand, bearing the sand reaps, you have a metaphor over there, and then the straw, straw and women's hair clogging the water gates, and then you have the example of wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, simile or a figure of speech has been used, but all these things to emphasize in the last line that the poets sang only of floods. So, there are so many things to see in a river, but the poets focused only on the aesthetics, the glorification of things, and then what of the flood is very important. He was there for a day, and probably by this the reference is to the modern poet, a poet with a distinctly different sense of sensibility. He was there for a day when they had floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual. So, you see that the typical other aspect of the flood is the kind of devastation that happens, the human misery, and you see that there is the other sensibility which is listening to all those components. The new poet still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned with perhaps twins in her, kicking at the blank walls even before birth. So, this is very important, that it is interrogating, it is challenging the older sensibilities, the traditional way of looking at things, that everybody celebrates beauty in poems and nobody starts interrogating, doing other things, functioning and doing other things with poems, and the poem functioning in a different way, doing other things, not just doing its traditional function, is something which is being presented over here. He said the river water has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour 3 village houses, a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda, and one pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies with different colored diapers to tell them apart. So, you see that the focus is that it is as if that if you are looking at a river, the river is poetic enough only at one point of time, and that is during the flood. There is probably nothing to talk about in the summer when the river does not have any water. There is probably nothing to talk about the various other things, even including ugly things like so called ugly things like a woman's hair and all those things, and these are things which probably need not be explored by the poet who follows the traditional poet, whereas the contemporary poet, the poet with the new sensibility, starts looking at these things and can derive insights from these components. So, if we go back to some of the thematic and stylistic contents that we were talking about, you see that Indian tradition and culture, temples, river in Madurai, personal style. So, the style is very personal, very distinctive. The theme is about what poetry deals with, what poetry should deal with, and yet it is written in a very distinctive style. It is about relationships, memories, emotions. In this case, it is not about any of these things, but definitely about emotions, about aesthetic emotions, about poetic sensibilities. There is an irony, distinctive element of irony, because the poets only celebrate the glory of the flood. Nobody looks at the other realities and the harsh realities that the flood brings. It is as if it is only the job of the newspaper people to take care of that, and not that of a poet. Understatements, he does not exaggerate, he does not say things too distinctively, too loudly. You can see that in the last lines, okay, the reiteration of the fact that the pregnant woman is carried away, and you see that which happens in the second stanza. In the fourth stanza, there is a repeat with a small variation, but there is no shouting, no anger, no expression of deep angst or agony, or no challenge, no aggressive challenge as to what is being done by the old poets and what is being done in a very traditional way. So, everything is in a understatement. Vignettes, small vignettes, in this case a story is not being told, small isolated components of what the river is able to depict, what the river carries, are being presented to us, and then they are kind of left for us, for our imaginations to be brought together within our imagination. So, the reason I did this first exercise was to make you aware of the fact that here is a poet, and any poet has to be understood, any poem has to be understood within a particular context, and it was important for us to create a context right now before moving on to the poem that we are supposed to do together. So, as I said with you, we are starting with the introduction today, and then we will move on to the details of the poem at a later point of time, but I will leave these quotes for you, and in tomorrow's session we will discuss and I will also share some papers with you, relevant papers which are not too complex, do not make things very difficult for all of us, but we must say that some Indian uses of history on a rainy day is a relatively more difficult poem when compared with the poems we have done so far. So, we start off by looking at that part of the poem which has not been done which is not a part of our text, but which relates to the text in a very integral way. If you are looking at the text of some Indian uses of history on a rainy day, then you find that the text has three components, and it is located in three different places. The section that you are right now seeing on your screens is the section which deals with Germany. There are two other sections, one deals with the experience in India, in Madras, and that is the third section which deals with the experience that we have in Egypt. And so, you find that Indian uses of history, or history being reflected, being questioned, being interrogated in three different contexts is what we are looking at. So, some Indian uses of history on a rainy day, you see that the section that we start off with in our text is the one which starts with Madras rain, and in that particular context you might say that particular section of the poem deals with a rainy day, but if you are looking at the other sections of the poems, probably you won't get any reference, very distinctive clear cut reference to any rainy day. They all deal with history, but not necessarily on a rainy day. It is possible that the poet initially conceived of the poem with only that section in mind and then extended it, and then liked the title of the poem and retained it because it had a unique ring to it, and it kind of set the mood for the entire poem. So, going back to this section of the poem, as I shared with you, let us start by looking at some of the thematic issues, some of the points that we are going to discuss. We will start by discussing the title, how he begins or introduces theme, and the play around locations like Madras, Egypt, Berlin, Calicut. So, these are some of the things which we will briefly discuss. And in this particular case, what we are going to do is that we are starting off by looking at that section of the poem of which you do not have, and it would be a good thing to have this section as well, because you can link it with the other sections as we proceed. 1935, Professor of Sanskrit and Cultural Exchange. So, short cryptic sentences, very brief, to the point, often you might say telegraphic, photographic, cinematographic, like you cut a film and put it next to the other one, it is like a montage, putting things together and asking you to link them together. So, we will come to that. So, 1935, Professor of Sanskrit and Cultural Exchange. So, you see that this particular poem especially deals with the academia to a certain extent, because this section deals with the Sanskrit professor who has come from India to Germany, and there is another section which deals with Fulbright Indians who are on a world tour or who are moving around Egypt during the summer at a particular point of time when they have probably saved enough money, and before coming back to India they are exploring history in different places, different cultures and contexts. So, 1935, Professor of Sanskrit and Cultural Exchange, passing through, lost in Berlin. Reduced to a literal turbaned child spelling grammar signs, German signs and doors, bus stops, trying to guess, go from stop, desperate for a way of telling apart a familiar street from a strange, or east from west at night. The brown dog that barks from the brown dog that doesn't, memorizing a foreign paradigm of lanterns, landmarks, a Gothic lotus on the iron gate, suddenly comes home in English, gesture and Sanskrit, assimilating the swastika on the neighbor's arm in that roaring bus from a grey nowhere to a green nowhere again. So, if you are looking at this entire poem very shortly, I would say very briefly, and with the economy of expression that is distinctive of Ramanujan, manages to tell us the story of an Indian, and that too a Sanskrit professor, getting lost in Germany, and it plays around the concept of languages, it plays around the concept of languages translated into literal signs meaning nothing when the language is unfamiliar to us, the kind of transformation that the linguistic incomprehensibility creates in somebody, and how one navigates through that, how somebody is lost, and what kind of insights one gains, derives in an alien culture where one is lost, and identifies suddenly a symbol that one is so very familiar with, and what kind of emotions it evokes in his mind. So, we going back to very ancient period of time, I would say, if you are looking at the Indian history, in the sense that if you are looking at 1935, it is for us and for students of IIT Kharagpur ancient. He is an ancient professor. 1935, Professor of Sanskrit and Cultural Exchange. In those days, people used to go out on cultural exchange, and you find that he is passing through. As he is passing through, he is probably not supposed to be at the place where he is right now. He is passing by, lost in Berlin, and you find that he is lost in Berlin, reduced to a literal turbaned child. The comparison to a child is because you find that he is not in a position to behave like an adult, communicate like an adult. Suddenly his vocabulary or the range of vocabulary is reduced to maybe a few babbles, incomprehensive babbles. So, it is beautiful expression of as if within a fraction of a second, once one is lost, one's identity from adult identity to a transformation into a child's identity has taken place, just like that, within a snap of a finger, because he is no longer able to navigate, and without the resource of language being available to us, being available to him, he is totally lost and is a child. Spelling German signs on door, bus and shops, because the alphabets are familiar. So, he is spelling them out as if imagining that by spelling them out he will be in a position to make sense of the entire thing. Trying to guess go from stop, identifying the differences, because he has absolutely no way of knowing even the very basics, because there is no clue. Desperate for a way of telling apart a familiar street from a strange, or east from west at night, and that too the difficulties are compounded because it is night and he is not able to make sense of things, because in the dark things become all the more unfamiliar and difficult. So, these are some of the issues that he is facing, and the brown dog that barks from the brown dog that does not. So, he is totally lost, and this is a certain element of irony, that he is not even able to tell apart functional components, memorizing a foreign paradigm of lanterns, landmarks. So, when one is without a language, when one is unable to find one's direction with the use of language, one starts taking recourse to icons, taking recourse to images, and taking recourse to a different way of different kind of a system of languaging. And then you find that this is this paradigm of foreign paradigm of lanterns, landmarks, Gothic statue on the iron gate, and so lantern and landmarks. A Gothic lotus in the iron gate suddenly comes home in English, gesture and Sanskrit assimilating the swastika on the neighbor's arm. So, the way he makes sense of the world is very, very different from the way that we generally make sense of the world through language. So, very interestingly, the poet has brought home to us the difficulties a person faces when one is without, one has lost one's language, or one is lost in a place where his language does not make any sense and he does not understand somebody else's language. So, in that particular context, what is it, how is it that he is experiencing history? He is experiencing history through understanding things which make sense to him, whose functionalities he is able to understand, like a lanterns, landmarks, Gothic lotus on the iron gate, that is suddenly able to make sense of that. Okay, this is a lotus, and the fact that it has a Gothic stylization is something which brings back memories of the way that he has understood these things in English. Okay, gestures, some of the gestures he is able to make sense of, and Sanskrit assimilating the swastika on the neighbor's arm. So, this is where the historical component comes in very significantly, that the swastika sign, which is very distinctive, an Indian sign and a Hindu sign, is something especially in the southern part of the country, and where the tradition is rich. They probably here, of course, we do not know whether he is from this, the professor is from the south or the north, though we know that the poet is from the south, but nonetheless, if you are looking at Sanskrit itself as a tradition, swastika plays a very significant role in it, and then you find that the swastika in the neighbor's arm, maybe he is in a bus, suddenly he realizes that okay, this is something which he is able to understand, he is able to relate to, and this is something which makes sense to him. And then the roaring bus from the grey nowhere to a green nowhere, which is not indicated here, is where his element of being lost is something which continues, but you see that there is at least one historical element which he is able to anchor to, which he is able to relate to. We do not really know whether it gives him solace or not, whether it makes things easier for him, but at least within an entirely distinctively unfamiliar surrounding, surrounded by rich history of traditions known to him or partly known to him, like the Gothic tradition, there is certainly something which jerks him to the familiarity of the Indian and the Sanskrit component, which is anchored in the sign or the symbol of the swastika. So, as I shared with you, we will move on to the other two sections in the next session, but as I shared with you, what happens here is that in each of the sections we will find that history is being used in a very unique way. History is being used in a very ironic, mildly humorous way, and when we put all the three things together, we find that a very interesting vignette comes, a very interesting poetic sensibility is brought home to us, which brings in the concept of Indian identity, and that is something which we will discuss as we move on to the other sessions in the next class. So, as we proceed, we will focus on the title, we will talk about the beginning and the introductory theme of each of the short text that we are going to do, and the way he plays around locations as a distinctive part of his style, as well as a distinctive part of this poem, where he is trying to communicate something very distinctive about the Indianness of the Indian people and certain Indian qualities or traits of the Indian people back to us. So, what we are going to do is I will reiterate some of the points I made right at the beginning. So, Indian tradition and culture, these are the components we will find throughout these three sections of the poem. The style is distinctively the style of Ramanujan. We will compare it with Ezekiel in the next class again to see how distinctively its styles vary, although both of them are Indian poets. How in this particular case memories and emotions play a significant role. Memories, history and emotions play a significant role. Irony, understatement, the cinematic and very cryptic, pithy, terse use of the English language without any kind of ornamentation, and the contrast between time and action, which is very distinctively a thematic component of the poems that we are going to do together. So, before we wrap up, there are just a few things I would like to share. Number one is that please take note of it, that we are going to focus on two distinctively different poems, because it is important for your exam perspective that you are able to draw a contrast between the ways in which these two poets write, and the way that the Indianness is distinctively differently identified and articulated by these two poets. This is one of the things, and then I would be taking you through the other two sections, relating it to the section that we did today, and then I would be doing the important questions that probably might come from this particular text, and the way that we might have questions which ask you to make a comparison between the two Indian English poets we are doing in this session. So, with that we will stop for today. Thank you for being with me, and we hope that in tomorrow's session we will wrap this poem, and we will continue with other things in the sessions to follow. Thank you very much.